Hey guys, it's Ivan from Indoor Ivan and welcome back to my channel. If you haven't done so already, make sure that you subscribe and like this video. I'm continuing my part 2 to winter, although it's not winter anymore, houseplant care video. So in this video we're going to take a look at different kinds of fertilizers you can use for your plants, also soil, and then pests as well. So let's begin. Alright, so let's get started. This is my little container of fertilizers that I use, and it all depends on kind of your style and your method of fertilizing. Some ways are a lot easier than others, but when you're out in the market and you're trying to find fertilizers, there's so many to choose from. You have granular fertilizer, you have fertilizer that you can dissolve in water, some that are already liquid, and then you also have organic choices. But in the end, it's really up to you as to what you want to be using. So I'm going to show you some of the things that I have. So there are things that you can get that are a slow release. So this is my Miracle-Gro slow release fertilizer. I do have some fertilizers that are dissolved in water, like my orchid, but for days that I feel a little bit lazy, I do have a liquid one that I use as well. And then for those of you who go organic, I do have this as well that I use occasionally. Very smelly, but it is organic, which is kind of nice as well. So when you're looking at a fertilizer, there are numbers that show up on it. So with my liquid plant food there, you'll see some numbers on there. I believe that's a 10-15-10 product there for you. So that goes over the percentage of nutrients that is in the fertilizer. So whenever you take a look at those three numbers, always think NPK, N being your nitrogen, so percentage of nitrogen that is available for your plants. Your plants do use nitrogen mainly for leaf growth, so that's something to keep in mind. Your next number on there is your 15, so that is going over phosphorus. So for most plants, this is dealing with flower production. So if you have any flowering annuals, that's a number that, or percentage, you want to be fairly high. And then the last number on there is your K, which is your potassium. So for that, that's more your overall plant growth and your root growth there. So when you do take a look at those, certain plants do require certain numbers to be higher. So if you're looking at a general purpose fertilizer, all the numbers could be fairly similar. But if you're looking at things like with a lot of leaves, your first number will obviously want to be higher compared to if you're looking at flower production, your middle number would want to be higher there. When I do use chemical fertilizers, I do dilute the fertilizer quite a bit, so I'll usually use half strength just to make sure that there's no accumulation of salts that build up in the soil. So if you're trying to decide whether or not to use something like a granular fertilizer or something like a liquid fertilizer, it is hard to decide. For me, it doesn't make a huge difference. I look more at the numbers on the fertilizer than the actual kind of method it's delivered in. But if you think about it, granular, your slow release fertilizer is probably the easiest and low maintenance in a way to use. When you buy plants and you see those little green balls, those are bits of fertilizer. So if you're someone who tends to forget to fertilize or doesn't want to fertilize regularly, whether it's because you need to mix things up or dilute your powder, slow release is fairly easy to use. The difference between powder and that's a concentrate. Not a huge difference. Again, it's up to you. I do like the liquid concentrate one because it's a lot easier to mix in my watering can than, say, a powder. But again, personal preference as to how you want to do it. Something else to keep in mind, most fertilizers do have a lot of micronutrients. So if you take a look at, say, the slow release fertilizer, you'll notice that there's a lot of extra nutrients that are also on there as well. So different things such as magnesium, copper, and iron is available. Some plants do need certain micronutrients more than others, so you can use other things. I had a problem with iron, so for example, I went out and I got some iron chelate. Some other things that you can use as well. Epsom salts is a great way to get some extra micronutrients as well. Most plants won't kind of show signs of these micronutrient deficiencies because there are some already in fertilizer. But if you do notice some strange leaf growth or your leaves look kind of funny, that is something to take a look at. You can always just Google it and see what those deficiencies look like in the leaves. Alright, so the next thing we're going to talk about is soil. So there is something to keep in mind. There are different kinds of soil. Your garden soil is a lot different than potting soil. So for your houseplants that you have at home, it's really important that the soil is able to hold moisture but at the same time be well draining. And that's the reason why you don't go out there into your backyard and grab garden soil, because it's really dense and heavy and it doesn't drain as easily. So when you're looking at different kinds of media to plant your plants in, there are a lot of things that you can choose from. There is potting soil, there is like cocoa coir, there's bark, gritty mix, and there's also moss. So there's many things that you can think about using for your plants, and there's also different kinds of amendments. So if you're looking at helping to retain some moisture, you might add some gel crystals, you might add some vermiculite. If you're looking at getting your soil to be a little bit airier and more well draining, you might use something like perlite or sand, and particularly with your cacti. If you're looking at really making the soil heavier to hold down your succulents, you might be adding sand. So there are a lot of different mixes and ways that you can make your own soil, and then also to buy soil as well. So let's go over the different types. Alright, so as you can tell, I am doing this video from the floor just because there's a lot of things that I need to be grabbing. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at is potting soil. So I tend to have this around in the house. Just general potting soil. It's usually peat moss and perlite. Sometimes I'll add vermiculite and some slow release fertilizer. I tend to use this for most of my plants just because it's a little bit tricky. There's so many different kinds of mixes, so this is my go-to. Another thing that people can grab are things like cocoa coir for their plants. I don't have very much experience with cocoa coir, so for the purpose of this video I won't be talking about it, but if you do decide that you want to Google it, go right ahead. Some other things that you can look at using for your plants also include things like bark. So for my orchids, I will use an orchid bark in general, just because it allows the plants to be well draining and to kind of create that environment that the plants are supposed to be in. And then the other thing that I also have as one of my go-to medias is sphagnum moss. So some of my orchids are in sphagnum moss just because that's what they started to grow in, and I've been too lazy to move them out of sphagnum moss into bark. But for my two staghorn ferns, they are in moss. Just because it's the easiest way to bind them to driftwood or to pieces of wood in general. So those are my three media that I tend to use, but there are a lot of things out there as well. If you grow bonsai, you might want to look at some gritty mix to use, and then if you also do things like hydroponics, there's different media for that as well. So there are different kinds. The only type of soil that I tend to be a little bit hesitant buying is like cacti and succulent soil. Yes, there is more sand in it to make it heavier, but I tend to kind of not get it. I tend to add a lot of perlite. So perlite I add to my potting soil in different proportions. So if I need a more well-draining soil, I will add a little bit more perlite to my potting soil. And if I need it to hold a little bit more water, I won't put as much perlite in. But in general, my idea of potting soil is it needs to be well drained. I try to make sure that my soil dries out, especially in the winter, in less than 2 weeks. Ideally a week, my soil is dried up. Because you never want your plants to be sitting in too much wet soil and water, because that is how you kill your plants, through overwatering. And if that soil isn't drying up, you're going to be watering it again, and it's just going to be a ripple effect of disaster. So when you're repotting your plants, there are some things to keep in mind. I tend to repot in the spring. That being, it's because in the winter your plants aren't really growing, so if you pot them into a bigger pot, it's not going to do a whole lot. And then also that shock as well. So I tend to wait until spring before I plant, and I will only pot up 1 or 2 pot sizes up. So if I'm going from a 4-inch, I might try to find a 6-inch pot. Nothing too big, so you don't want to be jumping too large of a pot. The only reason is because of that extra soil. If your plant isn't able to absorb all of that water through its roots, it's again more water that sits around the plant. So ideally, do try to just go up 1 pot size for your plants. And also when you're looking at different kinds of pots, whether it be plastic pots, clay pots, glazed pots, orchid pots, the type of pot you use will affect how fast the water kind of evaporates from your soil. So if you're using a plastic pot and you know you need that plant to dry out relatively quickly, you might want to amend your soil with something like perlite to make it a little bit more well drained. Whereas if you put something in an unglazed clay pot, you know that that moisture is going to be wicked away. So if you have a plant that tends to be more moisture loving, do keep that in mind, because you're going to have 2 counteracting properties there. I will say one thing with potting soil. When I buy my potting soil, I tend to just buy the regular potting soil. There are different kinds of soils out there, especially like your water retaining ones that keep your plants watered for longer. I tend to use that type of soil only for my outdoor plants. Reason being, when your plants are outside in the summer, like say for your annuals and your window boxes, it's fine because you tend to be watering your window boxes maybe every other day. With your houseplants, sure, it would be nice to have that water retained in the soil for a little bit longer, but once you bring those plants in for winter, that soil is going to take forever to dry up. So for that reason, I don't buy any water retaining soil for my plants. Alright, so last but not least, we're going to quickly talk about pests. When I went over this little section at a workshop that I was in, I did make people feel a little bit uncomfortable seeing a lot of these insects on plants, but it is a reality that you might come across some pests on your houseplants. You can take preventative measures, such as washing the leaves, making sure that any insects that are on there come off, make sure your soil dries out, especially for fungus gnats, and then make sure that your plants have proper air circulation. When you're out in the garden center, there are a lot of different things that you can choose from. There's like oils, there's like sprays, and then there's also like sticky traps. So there are a lot of different things that you can use. So when you come to a reactive solution, when you find that there are pests on your houseplants, then you can use things such as insecticides, miticides, fungicides, and then also sticky traps. When you decide that you're going to use something like an insecticide, like this one, these are for things such as aphids or mealybugs or scales or whitefly. You do have to make sure that when you do use something like an insecticidal soap, that you do make contact with those insects, because if they're not touching the soap and you're not covering them with the soap, they won't die. So that is something to keep in mind, and that's why the recommendations for a lot of these insecticidal soaps say to make sure that you repeat. Some people do choose to not use and go the chemical route. They'll use things such as a mild dish soap, which is an option as well, and then you can also use things such as rubbing alcohol to dab on things such as mealybug or scale. But again, it's up to you. I tend to use the soap because it's the easiest and I don't have time to Q-tip rubbing alcohol on these pests. So again, that decision is up to you. Something else that you can get is a miticide. So a miticide will target things such as spider mites and ticks. This isn't a product that I tend to use, so I will tend to use an insecticidal soap or something like a 3-in-1, which has miticide in it already. But for those of you who are just fighting specifically a target pest it might be cheaper to invest in one product instead of a more expensive 3-in-1. Something else that you might need to get or use, especially if you end up with things like powdery mildew, is a fungicide. So that takes care of a lot of fungus issues. Again, if you have a 3-in-1, that covers you, but if you decide that you want to get a fungicide, that's something that you can do. So powdery mildew, black spot, things that your plants can get, you want to use a fungicide for that. And last but not least, are dealing with things that end up flying. So for that, I tend to use sticky traps. So you can use sticky traps for things such as thrips, whiteflies, but I use it mostly for fungus gnats. So it is just a sticky piece of paper that you kind of stick near the top of the soil. So as the fungus gnats are flying about, they are getting trapped on these sticky traps. Fungus gnats lay their eggs in soil, which is high in organic matter. Those larvae end up hatching and eating a lot of that organic matter. So if you're able to catch the adults before they lay the eggs, you do eventually wipe out that population. Alternatively, some people will put sand on top so that way the adult fungus gnats don't go into the soil. I tend to dry out the soil so that way it's not the best place for fungus gnats to want to lay their eggs. Alright guys, so I hope that video was helpful for you. I tried to make it a little bit shorter than my last video because the other video did run a little bit longer. So anyways, until next time, bye.